Wren Calloway had never once, in 11 years of running the clinic at the edge of Ashcombe territory, treated a human patient on purpose. People healed on their own, mostly. A cut closed itself in a day if you were part of the pack. A broken bone knitted in a week if you rested it and didn't argue with your body about it. It was the animals who needed her. The real animals. The ones with 4 legs and no shift in them. The barn cats, and the hunting dogs, and the horses that pulled the supply carts down from the North Road. And when a wolf came to her in wolf form, tail low, paw held up like a question, she treated that too, because a wolf on 4 legs was, to her, no different from a fox with its foot in a trap. She didn't ask who was under the fur. She didn't want to know, knowing complicated things, and Wren liked her days uncomplicated. Her clinic was a long wooden building with a tin roof that rang like a bell when it rained, set back from the main road behind a stand of birch trees, close enough to the king's compound that she could see the tops of its towers from her porch, and far enough that she never had to think about them unless she chose to look up. She kept the place clean and sparse, shelves of jars, a table scrubbed pale from scrubbing, a cot in the back room where she slept more nights than not, because animals didn't wait for daylight to get themselves hurt, and neither did she wait for daylight to go and fix them. She had an assistant, a quiet, sharp-eyed young woman named Bertie, who had grown up 2 farms over and had a gift for calming spooked horses just by standing near them and saying nothing. Bertie did the books and swept the floor and told Wren, more than once, that she worked too much and smiled too little, and Wren always answered the same way, that smiling didn't set bones, and neither did resting, so she'd get to both eventually. It was a Tuesday, unremarkable in every way until it wasn't, when the bell over the clinic door rang, and a wolf limped in on 3 legs, dragging the 4th like it had forgotten how paws worked. Wren didn't look up right away. She was elbow-deep in a jar of salve, mixing it the way her mother had taught her. Slow circles, never fast, because fast ruined the texture. When she did look up, she saw the collar first, a wide leather band with a silver clasp, tooled with a mark she'd seen only twice before, once on a courier and once on a portrait hanging in the town hall. The mark of the king's own line. She set the jar down. "Well," she said, "to the wolf and to no one else, since there was no one else to say it to. Aren't you a long way from the towers?" The wolf whined, low and theatrical, and lifted the injured paw another inch, as if to make absolutely sure she'd seen it. She had seen 100 injured paws. She knew the shape of a real limp, the way an animal favored a leg without thinking about it, the way pain made the whole body go quiet and careful. This limp had a little too much performance in it, a small pause before the whine, like an actor waiting for the audience to notice the cue. But there was also, when she knelt and took the paw in her hands, a real scrape along the pad, real blood, real heat under her fingers. Not nothing. Just dressed up, like someone had taken a small injury and given it a costume. "Let's see," she murmured, mostly to herself, because talking to her patients, even the 4-legged silent ones, had always helped her think. Torn pad, not deep, ran into something with an edge. A fence, maybe. The wolf made a sound that might have been agreement, if wolves agreed to things, and rested its huge head against her knee while she worked, which no injured animal in 11 years of practice had ever done. Injured animals wanted to be left alone. They tolerated her hands because they had no better option, not because they wanted the company. She cleaned the wound, packed it, wrapped it in gauze, and told him, she supposed, though she still hadn't let herself think the word king, that he should stay off it for 2 days. He did not stay off it for 2 days. He was back on Thursday. The same paw. She recognized the wrap before she'd even finished unwinding it, because she'd tied that particular knot herself, and there it was, not 2 days old, already loosened like he'd been chewing at it on purpose. Underneath, the skin was clean, closed, healed the way wolf skin healed when nothing was actually wrong with it anymore. New and pink and a little tender, but whole. Wren looked at the paw for a long moment. Then she looked at the wolf's face, at the two dark eyes watching her with an attention that had nothing wrong with it either, nothing sleepy or pained about it at all. "You're healed," she said flatly. The wolf whined and pressed the paw toward her, insistent, the picture of suffering. "You are healed," she said again, slower, like she was explaining something to a child who was pretending not to understand a very simple rule. "I healed you 2 days ago, in this room." The tail thumped once against the floor, guiltily, she thought, though she reminded herself that reading guilt into a wolf's tail was exactly the kind of thing that got a person into trouble. She rewrapped the paw anyway, because refusing felt petty, and because some tiny, unprofessional part of her wanted to see what happened next, and let him go without further comment. But that night, in the ledger where she kept notes on chronic patients, the goat with the weak hip, the old hound with the cataracts, she started a new page. At the top she wrote nothing, no name, because she still didn't want to know the name, in case knowing it made this into something it currently was not. Under the blank heading she wrote, "Paw," again, and underlined it twice, hard enough that the pen nearly went through the paper. He came back 6 days later with a limp in the other front leg. She almost laughed. She caught herself before she did, because laughing felt like admitting something, and she wasn't ready to admit anything to a wolf with silver on his collar and an expression that was, if she let herself be honest for even 1 second, entirely too pleased with itself for an animal in supposed pain. "New leg," she said, kneeling. "Efficient. Rotating through your inventory." She checked it anyway. There was, this time, almost nothing to check. The faintest redness, gone by the time she'd finished looking for it, like a blush that had decided against staying. She wrapped it regardless, because wrapping a leg that didn't need wrapping was, she reasoned, still cheaper than arguing with a king's wolf about whether his leg needed wrapping, and arguing was a fight she suspected she would not win on the merits, only on volume. The third visit she caught something. She was reaching for the gauze on the shelf behind her, her back briefly to the exam table, and in the small dark window above the shelf, more mirror than window at that hour, with the lamp lit and the evening gone navy outside, she saw the wolf's reflection drop the limp entirely. 4 solid legs, weight even, head up, watching her back with an alertness that had nothing wrong with it at all. And then, a full 2 seconds too late, as if some internal bell had rung to remind him of the role he was supposed to be playing, the front leg folded up again, and the head drooped back into its performance of suffering. Wren stood very still with the gauze in her hand. She did not turn around immediately. She let herself have the moment, alone, facing the shelf, working out what to do with what she'd just seen. Because there were really only 2 paths available to a woman who had just caught the Alpha King's own wolf faking an injury in her clinic. One was to say nothing, ever, and go on treating imaginary wounds until the day one of them died of old age. The other was to say something, and she had never in her life been a woman who chose the first path when the second one was sitting right there, staring her in the face, tail thumping. She turned around. She did not sit back down. She crossed her arms and looked at him the way she looked at Bertie when Bertie tried to tell her she'd definitely swept under the supply cabinet. "You're the worst patient I've ever had," she said, "and I once treated a raccoon that had bitten off its own tail out of spite." The wolf's ears went back, not the flattened ears of shame. She knew shame in an animal, had seen it plenty, in dogs that had knocked over a milk pail and knew it. This was something else, something closer to being caught with your hand in a place your hand had no business being, and knowing it, and not being sorry enough to stop. "I don't know what you think this is," she went on, because once she'd started she found she couldn't stop, the words coming out steadier than she expected. "But I have goats with more subtlety than you. I have a rooster who fakes a limp to get out of being put back in his coop, and even he knows to keep the story straight for longer than 4 days. The wolf lowered himself to the floor, chin on his paws, and looked up at her with an expression that on a person she would have called sheepish, and on a wolf she chose, for the sake of her own sanity, not to name at all. She let out a breath. Some of the anger, if it had even been anger, and she wasn't entirely sure it had, wasn't entirely sure what emotion it actually was, sitting there in her chest like a held note, went out of her with it. "Fine," she said, and crouched down to his level, because that was easier somehow than standing over him and pretending this was a lecture. "Fine. You want to sit in my clinic. I don't know why. I'm not going to ask why. Because I have found, over many years, that asking why rarely gets a person an answer that helps them sleep at night." She reached out and scratched behind one large ear, an old habit, the same motion she used on every animal that came through her door, regardless of rank or species. "But you're going to start paying for these visits, real coin, no discount for whatever it is you are when you're not four-legged and dishonest." The wolf made a low sound in his chest that she chose to interpret as agreement, because the alternative interpretations were, in that moment, more than she had the energy for. He paid. That was the strange part, the part she turned over in her mind for days afterward, while she stirred salves and swept the porch, and tried, without much success, not to think about it. He paid, every single time, coin left on the table in a little leather pouch, more than the visit was worth, and a king, even a king wearing fur and a silver collar, did not pay for nothing. Paying was its own kind of confession. It said, "I know this is not a real transaction. I am buying something else. I do not know how to ask for it honestly, so I am buying it the only way I know how, which is with more money than the thing is worth, in the hope that the excess covers the dishonesty." She started to notice things she hadn't let herself notice before, now that she was looking. The way he arrived, always in the late afternoon, when the light through the birch trees went gold and slow, never at dawn when the clinic was busy with real patients, never at night when she was too tired to talk. The way he watched her hands specifically, not her face, not the room, her hands, like they were doing something to him that had nothing to do with medicine. The way, when Bertie came through with the account book and made some comment about the size of that latest pouch of coin, the wolf's ears turned toward the sound with an attention that was almost human in its focus, as if he understood every word and was cataloging it somewhere for later. She started charging him for tea, too. She wasn't sure when that habit began, only that one evening she found herself pouring a second cup out of pure reflex and setting it on the floor near where he lay, and he had drunk from it, carefully, so as not to knock the cup, which was its own kind of small miracle for an animal with paws instead of hands. And after that, it simply became part of the visit. Wrap a leg that did not need wrapping. Pour a cup of tea that a wolf, technically, should not have wanted. Sit on the floor of her own clinic, in the gold evening light, and talk to an animal who could not talk back, about the goat's hip, and the old hound's eyes, and whatever else came into her head that day, because it was easier to talk to something that couldn't answer, and because some tired, unprofessional corner of her heart had started, against every rule she had for herself, to look forward to it. Bertie noticed before Wren was ready to admit there was anything to notice. "That's the king's wolf," Bertie said one evening, not a question, watching through the window as the animal in question made his slow, theatrical way up the porch steps. "I'm aware," Wren said, not looking up from the jar she was labeling. "He's here a lot. He has a lot of legs to injure." Bertie gave her a look that Wren had grown used to over the years, the look of a young woman who thought she knew more about her employer's inner life than her employer had given her permission to know, and which was, infuriatingly, usually correct. "You know who he is when he's not a wolf." "I do not know who he is when he's not a wolf," Wren said, which was true, technically, in the narrow way that made it not quite a lie. "I know who he is when he is a wolf, because that is the only version of him that has ever been in my clinic." "Convenient," said Bertie, and went back to the account book, and did not bring it up again, though Wren caught her smiling into the ledger more than once over the following weeks, in a way that made Wren want to throw a jar of salve at her, gently, out of love. The visits went on, 5 weeks, then 6. The fence that had caused the very first very real injury was fixed within the first fortnight. Wren heard about it from a courier who came through for salve, heard that the king himself had sent men out to replace the broken rail the very next morning, which struck her, at the time, as an oddly fast response for a fence in a territory with 3 others just as large to manage. It was only later, turning the fact over in her mind the way she turned over difficult splints, that she understood the fence being fixed should have meant the visits stopped. There was, after the fence was fixed, no possible way for that particular wolf to keep running into that particular hazard, and yet the visits did not stop. They simply changed shape, a limp in the back leg now, a scrape along the ribs that appeared and vanished within the same week. Once, memorably, an entire afternoon spent limping on a leg that Wren was fairly sure did not connect to any injury at all, current or historical, because when she pressed along every joint from paw to shoulder she found nothing, not even the ghost of old tenderness, and the wolf had simply lain there and let her search, watching her face the entire time with an expression that dared her to say something about it. She didn't. Not that day. There was a night, she remembered it later as the raccoon night, because that was the case that had kept her up until well past midnight, an old raccoon with a wound gone bad, brought in by a farmer's boy in a panic, and she had worked through it with her sleeves rolled up and her hair falling out of its knot, hands steady even when her heart wasn't, because that was the job, that was the whole of the job, staying steady when the animal in front of you couldn't. The raccoon lived. Barely, but it lived, and by the time she'd finished cleaning up and sent the farmer's boy home with instructions and a jar of ointment, it was well past midnight, and she was so tired her hands had started to shake with the specific, hollowed-out exhaustion that came after fear had nowhere left to go. She found the wolf on her porch when she finally went to lock the door. He wasn't limping, he wasn't performing anything at all, as far as she could tell, just sitting, upright, watching the dark tree line with the stillness of something that had been there a while and intended to stay a while longer. When she stepped out, he turned his head, and there was none of the usual theater in it, none of the drooped ears or the exaggerated whine, just a long look, and then he shifted his weight, just slightly, so that his shoulder rested against her leg when she sat down on the porch step beside him, which she did without entirely deciding to, her body making the choice before her mind caught up to it. "Bad night," she said, to the dark, to the trees, to the wolf, to whoever was listening. Raccoon got into a fight with something bigger than a raccoon. I don't know if he'll make it through till morning. The wolf made no sound. He simply sat, warm against her side while she talked about the raccoon, and then, because it was late and she was tired and there was no one awake in the whole territory to overhear her being anything less than perfectly composed, about other things too. About the winter 11 years ago, when she'd taken over the clinic from the old healer who'd trained her, a woman long dead now, who used to say that the animals never lied to you. Not really, not the way people did, because an animal in pain simply hurt, out loud, without shame, and there was something almost restful in that honesty, something Wren had built her whole life around, this quiet corner of the world where the patients told the truth with their bodies, even when they couldn't speak it with their mouths. "Which is why," she said, turning her head to look at him properly for the first time that night, "you have been very rude, showing up here week after week, telling lies with your body. I built this whole life on animals not lying to me, and you come in here dressed up as a patient with nothing wrong with you, over and over, and I don't." She stopped. She hadn't meant to say that much. The exhaustion had loosened something in her chest that usually stayed tightly wound, and it had come out sideways, more honest than she'd intended. The wolf watched her. His eyes, in the dark, caught what little light there was and held it, steady, unblinking, and there was nothing in them that looked away. "I don't mind though," she admitted, quieter now, to the trees mostly, because it was easier to say to the trees than to him. That's the stupid part. "I don't mind at all." She fell asleep, in the end, right there on the porch step, her head tipping sideways until it found his shoulder, and when she woke at dawn, stiff, cold, furious at herself for sleeping outdoors like a stray, he was gone, but there was a blanket over her that had not been there before, thick and dark and smelling faintly of wood smoke, and she had absolutely no idea, sitting there in the gray early light, how a wolf without hands had managed to fetch a blanket, fold it, and lay it over her without waking her in the process, and that not knowing bothered her far less than she expected it to. The raccoon lived. By some small mercy, the raccoon lived, and Wren spent the following week in the particular good mood that came after a difficult save, humming while she worked, which Birdie noted with visible relief, because Wren humming meant Wren sleeping again, at least a little. It was on the 7th week, on a visit that started exactly like every other visit. The bell over the door, the three-legged approach, the dramatically lifted paw, that things stopped being something she could keep filing under paw again. In her private ledger, she kneeled to examine the leg out of habit more than expectation at this point, half a joke between them by now, a ritual neither of them fully believed in anymore, but both of them kept performing anyway because it gave them a reason to be in the same room. She had her hands on the leg, was running her thumb along the joint the way she always did, when the leg under her hands simply stopped being a leg. It happened fast and slow at once, the way she imagined lightning must feel from the inside, all at once, and yet somehow with enough time to notice every separate part of it happening. Fur giving way to skin under her palm, the shape of the limb lengthening, reshaping, bones shifting with a sound like knuckles cracking, except everywhere, all through the body at once. She sat back hard, more from surprise than fear, gauze still clutched uselessly in one hand, and when she looked up from the leg that was no longer a leg, there was a man sitting on her exam table, where a wolf had been a heartbeat before, dark-haired, broad-shouldered in a way that made the small wooden table look faintly ridiculous underneath him, wearing nothing but an expression she could only describe as caught. Not caught the way a boy is caught stealing sweets, caught the way someone is caught when a private thing they've been carrying quietly for a long time is suddenly, without their permission, out in the open air where anyone might see it. Wren stood up. She did this partly for dignity, and partly because her legs had gone unreliable underneath her, and standing seemed, in the moment, like the safer of the two options. She started, and then stopped, because there were several ways to finish that sentence, and none of them felt like the right one to say out loud to a king, sitting half-dressed on her exam table. "I am," he agreed, which was not an answer to anything, but somehow landed like one anyway. There was a long silence. Outside, a bird was doing something ordinary in the birch trees, calling to another bird, entirely unaware that anything unusual was happening inside the small building beneath it. "You could have said something," Wren said finally, when the silence had gone on long enough that someone needed to break it, and it was clear he wasn't going to be the one to do it. "At any point. In the last 7 weeks. You could have simply said something." "I could have," he agreed again. "That's not an explanation." "No," he said. "It isn't." She crossed her arms, mostly to give her hands something to do besides shake, though she told herself it was for the sake of looking stern, and she thought, from the small, careful way he was watching her, that he wasn't fooled by the gesture either way. "Then give me one. An explanation. You've had 7 weeks to prepare it." He was quiet for a moment, looking not at her but at his own hands, resting on his knees, as if the answer might be written somewhere on his palms if he looked long enough. "You don't flinch," he said finally. "At anyone. I've watched you set a leg wrong the first time and correct it without a single change in your face. I've watched you sit up half the night with a raccoon that had no business surviving and talk to it like it mattered more than anything else in the territory, because to you, in that hour, it did. Everyone I meet flinches. They agree with me before I've finished a sentence. They apologize for things that aren't their fault, because apologizing to me feels safer than not apologizing. I have not had an honest conversation with another living person in longer than I can easily remember." He looked up at her then, and there was nothing performed in his face at all, none of the theater she'd gotten so used to reading in his ears and his tail. "I wanted to know what it felt like, to be in a room with you and not be flinched at, and I did not know how to ask for that honestly, so I invented a paw." Wren stared at him. Somewhere in the back of her mind, in the calm, clinical part of her that diagnosed things for a living, she registered that this was, without question, the single strangest explanation any patient had ever given her for anything, in 11 years of very strange explanations, including the man who'd once insisted his goat had been possessed by his late uncle. "You invented a paw," she repeated. "Several paws," he said. "Over time, I tried to vary it, so it would seem more plausible." It did not seem more plausible. It seemed like you were running out of legs. Something in his face shifted, not quite a smile, but close enough to its neighborhood that she found herself, despite everything, fighting not to answer it with one of her own. "I am aware," he said, "that I am not, historically, a subtle man." "You are aware," Wren said, "that I have a rooster with more subtlety than you, and I have told you this, weeks ago, while you were still wearing fur and pretending not to understand human speech." "I understood every word," he admitted. The rooster comparison was, at the time, deeply wounding. "Good," she said, though the corner of her mouth had, without her permission, started to curve upward, and she gave up trying to stop it, because there didn't seem to be much point anymore. It was meant to be. He stood, then, slowly, the way a man stands when he is trying very hard not to take up more space than the room can comfortably hold, and reached for the shirt someone, Birdie presumably, tactfully, from somewhere just outside the door where she had apparently been standing guard for reasons Wren intended to ask about later, had left folded on the stool beside the table. He pulled it on without ceremony, and when he was dressed, he simply stood there, in the middle of her small, clean clinic, looking somehow both larger and less certain of himself than the wolf who'd been sitting there a minute before. "I don't expect you to be pleased," he said, "about any of this. I lied to you, in the smallest, strangest way a person can lie, for 7 weeks, and I understand if that has cost me something I can't easily buy back, not even with coin, which I am aware I have been throwing at you rather badly, in place of an honest word." Wren considered this. She considered, too, the blanket that had appeared over her without waking her, and the way he'd watched her hands and not her face for 7 weeks, and the low, warm sound he'd made when she scratched behind his ear that she had told herself, at the time, meant nothing at all. "I'm not pleased," she said finally, honestly, because honesty seemed to be the only currency either of them had left that hadn't already been spent badly. "I don't love being lied to, even in the smallest, strangest way a person can manage it." She paused. "But I understand it, which is a different thing from being pleased about it, and I want you to know I'm aware of the difference, so you don't walk out of here thinking you've been forgiven for something you haven't actually apologized for yet." "I apologize," he said, immediately, with the particular speed of a man who has been waiting for permission to say it. "Better," she said. "Try it again, with fewer paws involved." "I am sorry," he said, "that I did not simply ask to sit in your clinic and drink tea, like a person, instead of inventing an injury every week for 2 months. That's more like it." She picked the gauze back up off the table, mostly out of habit, and found she had nothing left to wrap with it. No wound, no leg, nothing but a man standing in the middle of her floor looking, for the first time since she'd known him in either shape, genuinely unsure of what came next. It softened something in her, watching that, this man who ran 3 territories and spoke in decrees, standing in her small clinic with a borrowed shirt and no idea what to do with his hands. "Next time," she said, setting the gauze down, "just say you want tea. I have tea. It is considerably cheaper than gauze, and it does not require me to explain to my assistant why the king's wolf's leg has healed for the 9th time in 2 months. Something in his shoulders loosened, visibly, like a held breath finally let go. "Next time," he agreed. "Tea. No pause." "No pause," she confirmed, "unless they're actually injured, in which case I will treat them, as I have always done, and you will not receive a discount for rank, king or otherwise." "I would not dream of asking for one." "You would," she said. "You'd dream about it constantly, but you wouldn't get one, and eventually you'd stop asking, the way you eventually ran out of legs to injure." He laughed, actually laughed, a short, surprised sound, like it had gotten away from him before he'd decided whether to let it out, and it changed his whole face, took some years and some weight off it that she hadn't fully noticed were there until they weren't. "I've missed talking to you," he said, and then seemed to hear how that sounded, coming from a man who had, technically, been talking to her, or at least sitting in the same room while she talked, nearly every week for 2 months. Properly, I mean. With words. "You've had words this whole time," Ren pointed out. "You simply chose not to use them." "A tactical error," he admitted. "In my defense, I did not expect the fake injuries to work quite so well for quite so long. I assumed you would catch on by the second week." "I did catch on by the second week," she said, and watched his eyebrows go up. "I simply chose not to say anything, because I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I did not mind the company, even dishonestly delivered." He looked at her for a long moment, something working behind his eyes that she couldn't quite read, not the way she could read a limp, or a fever, or a wound gone bad, and for once she found she didn't mind not being able to read it. Some things, she thought, weren't meant to be diagnosed on the first look. "Tea then," he said, "tomorrow, as myself. No fur, no pause, no theater." "Tomorrow," she agreed, "though I reserve the right to make you sit on the floor anyway, out of habit. I would expect nothing less." He left the way he'd never once left as a wolf, through the front door, upright, on 2 legs, with the bell ringing once behind him and Bertie, from somewhere near the supply cabinet where she had very clearly been listening this entire time, making a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a cough, and was in fact entirely unconvincing as either. "Not a word," Ren said, without turning around. "I didn't say anything," said Bertie, in the tone of someone who intended to say a great deal, later, at length, and possibly with illustrations. "You're thinking it very loudly." "I'm allowed to think," Bertie said. "You never put a rule in the account book about thinking." Ren picked up her ledger, the one with the private page in it, the one that had started, weeks ago, with 2 words underlined hard enough to nearly tear the paper. She looked at it for a moment. "Paw," again. And then, because the joke had earned its ending, she turned to a fresh page and wrote something new at the top instead, something with no injury in it at all, and did not show it to Bertie, and did not, when Bertie asked what she was writing, offer any explanation beyond a small, private smile that Bertie chose, wisely, not to push any further. He came back the next day, not limping, not on 4 legs at all. He came up the porch steps like an ordinary man come to visit an ordinary woman, and Ren had a second cup already poured and waiting, sitting on the table this time, at chair height, because there was no longer any reason for either of them to sit on the floor, though she noted, with some private amusement, that he chose to anyway, settling onto the boards near her feet, the way he had for 2 months, out of what she suspected was simple, honest habit, rather than any remaining need for pretense. The bell over the door rang most weeks after that, sometimes for animals, real ones, honest ones, the goats and the horses, and the occasional stubborn rooster that Ren treated exactly as she always had, with steady hands and no ceremony. And sometimes, in the late afternoon, when the light through the birch trees went gold and slow, it rang for a man who had run out of legs to injure, and had finally, belatedly, worked out that the truth had been available to him the entire time, sitting right there on the exam table, waiting for him to simply say it out loud. She never did write his name at the top of that private page in her ledger. She found, in the end, she didn't need to. Some things a person keeps track of without ever needing to give them a heading, and this, she decided, watching him drink tea from a cup that was slightly too small for his hands, careful not to spill it the same way he'd once been careful not to spill it as a wolf, was one of those things.